Hello again. Sorry we got cut off. I was just making sure that you are clear about what you were being asked to do. So here we are on Friday, April the 10th, Friday. This is, we can say this is our last class. I mean, this is the last video that you will receive. Next week you're on vacation, which I hope you will be able to benefit from. And which means that our last, class per se will be on the 24th, in 2 weeks, on the 24th of April. And I will ask you to hand in the three assignments that we discussed, your two speeches, and your, I'm sorry, just 1 second. I will ask you to hand in your two speeches, meaning your two speeches and your analysis by that date. That would be great. So that means for many of you, you have some more speeches to give, right? So we've kind of gone through a trajectory, and you will probably have noticed that we have kind of gone towards sort of this notion of sort of being sort of self-aware and what might be described as reflexivity, and that was basically the object of that last lesson, which was entitled "Seriousness in the Self." And so the idea was that you can use creatively, perhaps a feeling of unease that you might spontaneously have, that really comes from this feeling that you're thinking, how important is it really in the great scheme of things to give a speech, right? That's actually a sort of a Shakespearean reflection that can kind of take you places. So you can kind of convert that sort of skepticism about the importance of something as non-essential as giving a speech. You can kind of convert that into you can actually use that to actually produce things. So that can be thought of as actually reflexive, right? You're kind of reflecting about your own speech to make a speech, right? Okay, a little bit circular, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be overly kind of inward turning, but that can be that can help you to create, right? That's part of what we discussed last week. So this week I'm going to move on to this idea of being reflexive, and this is going to be a little bit geared towards the idea of sort of the media, and the fact that often you're recording your speeches this time, and there might be, because of that, this idea of recording speeches can maybe also heighten the fact that there's in today's sort of media infused age, and I've noticed that a lot of you have given speeches about a lot of you give there's already been a few speeches on the internet, and that comes, even if the speech isn't about the internet, that comes up a lot, right? This is something that is sort of at the center of your reflection. So there you can think of the fact that you can sort of once again try to kind of keep this awareness of sort of the larger scale of things, and you're aware that you're communicating something, right? We said that that's the principal idea is that you're analyzing your audience and your relationship, what they already know, what they already what their sort of feelings may be about something that you're going to talk about, and you want your goal is really to connect with that audience and to really not necessarily only just make your message come across, but that you want them to have a good time, and that's a lot of what a successful speech is about. That is a sort of this, we could say, and we noticed we talked about theater when we talked about that a little bit, because there's this sort of immediate relationship between the speaker and the audience, who is right in front of the speaker, right? But there is another dimension, and because in today's day and age, so much communication is through because of technology, is through all kinds of media, where we could be using computer and phones, and by the way, we have text messages. The communication is really in today's day and age is just I don't need to tell you this. I should just remind you of the fact that everything about communications and technology doesn't really, in a sense, I don't want it doesn't have to disappear, right, during your in your speech. In a sense, you're kind of competing, and you're sort of competing with, the media when you're giving a speech, a direct speech with people that are in front of you, right? Classic, sort of old school style speech, right? In a sense, you're that's sort of a, I would think teachers were kind of in that same situation where we're kind of doing an old school class that's kind of competing with sort of newer, more powerful forms of communication, which have their advantages and disadvantages, right? A lot of things that you learn are going to be on YouTube, and who knows what else. We'll use YouTube in this class, so it's maybe not, this distinction is maybe not so simple, but so part of your being reflexive about your own speech might be to sort of, in a sense, think about how to use, right, and the fact that your communication is, direct, old school, analog communication, if you will, and then there is sort of digital communication, which is sort of exponentially more powerful. That it is in this whole global sphere of communication. It is influenced by that you are, whether we like it or not, in today's day and age, a great amount of communication is made digitally, right? So that means that actually changes the very nature of your own communication, whether you like it or not, right? That might seem a little bit sophisticated, but to sort of illustrate what I mean, I've actually included 4 videos this time, and you can watch them at your leisure. I'm not going to check if you watch them or not. It's up to you. And the first one is and they're sort of different situations. There's sort of opposite ways to treat this question of the media, how you communicate with your audience, how you can completely embrace media in your speech, or you can sort of you can sort of pretend that it doesn't exist and almost give your speech sort of in opposition to that. Now, one example. Now, I'm going to go through these 4 speeches, and one of them is the Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard, and she had a confrontation, which the head of the opposition, who had made repeated misogynistic complaints, and who also in the Australian Parliament was making allegations against a member of Gillard's government. Because this member of her government had made misogynist remarks, and therefore Julia Gillard, lambasts the person who makes these accusations, and saying that it is completely hypocritical that he of all people is the least suited to make such accusations. And she goes through a sort of a litany of this person's sexist comments, right? And what's interesting about that is that she is we notice, we always get this feeling when we see let's say a scene from the British Parliament and the Scottish Parliament, or it could be the Irish Parliament or the Welsh Parliament. It seems it's a little bit different in the U.S. because we feel as if we don't have these sort of venerable institutions. Even we really get the feeling we have these leather seats, we have this sort of traditional setting, we have sort of this whole ritualistic way. The people are really close together, which is by the way a problem for coronavirus in England, of course. But we get the feeling that we're in this sort of centuries old way of communicating, right? And it's interesting because we have a lot of the I wouldn't say quotation, right? Remember, we've talked a lot about quotation that Gillard makes of her, her I want to say her opponent. These are statements that he made in, let's say, in text messages and on TV, right? And so it's interesting to see the way that you can kind of integrate, TV clips, text messages into a sort of I would say sort of a more traditional communication setting, right? And that provides for interesting contrasts, and that's a lot, like that gives, and that in a sense it makes her speech she has a sort of, she seems to be sort of very authentic, right? Because this is we're kind of coming down to this, that we get the feeling as if this setting here, this parliamentary setting, is sort of the seat of truth and authentic speech, right? So that's one aspect, right? Where the sort of direct communication, right, is can be sort of seen as sort of the bedrock of sort of true communication, as opposed to I would say, not necessarily fake, but the sort of the more sort of devalued means of communication, in the media, right? And we can think of, for example, someone like I'm trying. No, I don't want to get too far into details. I'm very tempted to get in more explanation, but we'll stop there. Moving on to our now we can move on to our next speech, and which is somewhat similar. We have the speech by Dan Carlin, who it's a very interesting speech on once again this whole idea that we have to really become aware of how communication. He goes through sort of a timeline on how much communication, how significantly and how quickly media communication has changed, and how much that really changes the way we communicate from the 70s up until he gives his speech in 2015 up until 2015. And it's a very sort of eloquent statement, and it's really important to note that on the stage there is a screen behind him, and even the way he's dressed as sort of, he has a baseball hat on. He seems to he sort of presents himself as sort of the everyday man, and it's actually surprising because when he's very very eloquent and very very well educated, which is refreshing because he doesn't we get the feeling that he is not as pretentiously dressed as a college professor might be. So but it's interesting to notice that he gives a fairly lengthy, I think it's a 15-minute speech on medium and technology, with as sort of very simply dressed, and we get the feeling he has sort of baggy jeans, I think, or baggy pants, and he has a very sort of a very straightforward manner, and he doesn't use media in his speech. We get the feeling that he is sort of, especially his movement around the stage, he's sort of isolated on the stage, and he is in sort of direct, sort of sincere communication with the audience. So that's interesting that's an interesting approach, right? And we can contrast this with the two finals. So we can, in a sense, put these two speeches together as sort of authentic, sort of direct communication that is sort of that can be contrasted with sort of media communication. Now, as now on the other hand, the last two speeches, I would say, differ from this sort of in the way that they rely actually for communication on the media, right? So once again, this is the whole idea, is that there's a lot of different approaches you can have, right? But whether you like it or not, we're kind of in this sort of this global village that Marshall McLuhan, that is a quotation from Marshall McLuhan, talks about, is that we're all kind of we can't just pretend that communication, we can't sort of make the clock go back, right? As if communication was not a great part of significant communication was not mediatized, right? So now let's move on to the speeches that really use the media, and we have Hans Rosling's, right? And we've already seen a Hans Rosling speech, and it was a speech that he made later. And notice that we have 3 TED Talks. The preceding speech that I talked about was a TED Talk. Hans Rosling's, this is a TED Talk, and the final one I'm going to talk about is a TED Talk. So this is a lot about communications and technology already. There's tons of these. Notice given to a lot of people around the world in these sort of very new, very modern conventions. So here we have Hans Rosling speaking, and so we've seen, and I think it was in the first or the second class, a Hans Rosling speech that he gave a few years later, right? And notice he used, remember that he sort of made a joke that he sort of before used to use digital technology, and now he's moving on to sort of analog technology. He said digital, but digital technology. And now he's moving on to this analog technology by representing population, right? 1 billion people by a sort of a box that he bought from IKEA. Hopefully, you can remember that. And hopefully you'll realize that but at one point he kind of went back to the way he used to give speeches, and this speech is another example of that. This is the way that he uses all kinds of computer representation in motion to give his speech. And what's very interesting, by the way, is how he starts his speech with a great joke about very sort of self-mocking speech about the elite Swedish students as well, even and also professors, saying that they're actually they don't know their knowledge of these matters of world well-being. And this is something that a lot of us are, myself included, are probably more ignorant about than we would care to admit, but such is the case. But he, after he he's done with his joke, he moves on to the heart, or the real meat of his speech is done with, and I would say using and in conjunction with the media, right? We have his whole animation show discussing sort of life expectancy as these sort of balls that move along. And it's really interesting actually to notice how animated he is as these balls move, right? So that's one way to really think that you can kind of embrace this whole idea of the most modern media possible. And by the way, especially because this is about he is one of the he is no longer living. I think he died a year or two ago. But at any rate, he he's an expert on he's sort of one of the leading experts in sort of new techniques for processing lots of data, also data about that we used to have this kind of data, much more of this data, unfortunately, in Western countries, and he's greatly expanded, having a much larger database for all the countries of the world. So we have not only do we have a vastly increased methods for accumulating data, but also for processing data, and also for actually representing data, right? Okay, and that's really it's important to note that is as much a part of what he does is the revolution is how do you show this data to lots of people, right? So that is really part and parcel of his speech, right? You can't really dissociate the way he gives from the speech from what he talks about. And because of that, it's really interesting to note that he sort of embraces these new world, I would say these sort of modern methods of representation. And it's interesting to see that his speech gets much more animated, right, as he follows the animated data, right? That's something that you might notice when you watch his speech. So that's one approach, right? Sort of embracing media, right? And that makes his sort of voice, it brings it to life, right? So it's like the machines make him come to life. There's a paradox there. But that's something that you might want to think about, because I'll talk about that later. And then finally, we have the final speeches by we have Mark Ronson, who is a music producer. I think I'm pretty sure that he produced Amy Winehouse, and he's a real he's a real technology. He uses sampling a lot. He's a real he knows how to use all kinds of machines. So he's giving a speech about sampling, right? And so of course that sampling is he's very interested in the fact that we have this idea of the sort of direct production of something and then a reproduction of something through a medium, right? So and it's interesting to note that the opening of his he's giving this speech about music. It's a TED talk once again. This is the third TED talk that I've sent you today. It's interesting to note that the opening of his speech is he sort of makes a sort of hip hop beat with his MPC out of the opening theme for the TED Talk, right? And then he goes through a sort of a compendium, right, of other speakers. You can see them that are speaking. And what's very interesting, I don't know how he does this, but somehow he has a sort of record that's scratching, right? And as he moves the record scratching I don't know if he's sort of trickery or how he does it, but as he moves the scratching, the images, and that images sort of go back and forth with the record going back and forth. It's perfectly synchronized. It's pretty impressive, right? And you can see all these different snippets, right, of other people and he sort of strings them together, right? And so that's why is that interesting to say he's giving a speech, but he's not actually speaking, right? He's actually letting the media, in a sense, speak for him. So that's sort of, I would say, the opposite end of the spectrum, compared with especially the second speech, right? I would say, which is the one by Dan Carlin. So here we have an example of the one approach is really to embrace the media and think of this, make you think of at some time, we're talking about a speech. This is about you actually physically speaking. You can actually make a speech, with technology. You can actually make a speech without physically speaking. That's sort of the extreme case, right? So that's sort of one end of the spectrum. So that, of course, this is sort of the final statement that we can have for this semester. It can lead you sort of, and we can think of that being sort of reflective. Well, what is a speech? Well, actually, sometimes a speech is actually not a speech. It's sort of using other people's. It's sort of making a collage, right? Using media technology to make a sort of collage of other people's speeches, and then you snip them together, and that's your speech, right? So that's, of course, we know what plagiarism. I wouldn't call that plagiarism. I would call that collage and interpretation. But that's because obviously it's nice to know what plagiarism is. He's not pretending that he is them. It's very openly saying, oh, this is someone else saying something. This is someone else saying something, and stringing these, sort of synthesizing all these quotations. And then later, it's interesting that he does give a speech, and he comes back to using his sort of media technology. So these are just things to think about. So you might want to, maybe in your last speeches, and also later in your life when you are going to be presenting things in public, really think of another quotation by Marshall McLuhan. I just said Marshall McLuhan. Read anything by Marshall McLuhan if you're interested in this. And he's sort of one of the founders of sort of media studies. He's a really great literary critic. Also, he says the medium is the message, right? So I would say sometimes, I'm not saying this you have to do this on all your speeches you're going to be sending me, but because I like this idea that hopefully this class will help you later to communicate in different kinds of settings. But the idea is not to think of the sort of technical support as sort of just sort of a mere tool or an obstacle, right, to your sort of direct communication. But you can use that as communication of itself, and you can kind of manipulate it, and it can be you can kind of go very farther than I can, because I think a lot of you are much sort of more able. You're much sort of more savvy with your computer skills and whatnot, so that you could really use that to your advantage, and it can really make your speech take off, right? And that the whole paradox of it being a speech, but some of it isn't really a speech, and that's okay, right? That's you. If you do a Mark Ronson thing for your second speech, wonderful. So that is that. I unfortunately I would have liked to see you all before the semester is over. So we will have to have sort of a video little. In a sense, I will see you because I'll be seeing your final videos that you're going to send me. But I would have liked to see you in person. I wish you the best of luck for this at the end of this semester, and that everything goes well, and that we'll all be on our feet come October. Okay, take care. Bye.